We have, so clearly something is happening. Systemic approaches, we've heard, collective action by business itself, by business and labor together, but clearly still challenges to collaboration between the two, the need for binding agreements, and I think some real questions around what works in terms of getting people to the table, keeping them there, and ensuring that things are implemented. I don't want to talk for too long. It was a really fascinating discussion. I want to throw the floor open. If there's a couple of questions, we have 10 minutes that we could take some questions from the floor. I see one right here, Kathleen.
Thank you. I'm Kathleen Jennings from Fafo. 3 really interesting, excellent presentations. I just want to ask Francis, this might be outside the scope of what you're doing or what you're able to talk about, but the recruitment and the kind of migration route that you described is obviously highly gendered, and you have very similar situations with women being recruited into care work, whether that's in national health services like in the UK, or into more private arrangements, as well as into domestic service, which is predominantly privately organized, but through brokers, especially in the recruiting countries, where they also are essentially debt-bonded labor, but their labor happens in the invisible sphere of the home, which makes them oftentimes much more, even more precarious. I wonder if you can, if the sort of ways you're trying to work with companies can also be used in these sort of arrangements, and then especially where government health services, for example, are involved, like the NHS. What kind of regulations, how can you also hold local health services accountable for this kind of bonded labor and recruitment? Thank you.
That's a great question. It is very gendered, and I think with regard to the women migrant workers predominantly into the health sector and domestic, obviously the Philippines is the country that comes to mind most of all, and arguably the government, the sending country government, that has done the most to regulate. It's by no means perfect, but it's a lot further along in terms of regulation and enforcement of that regulation than certainly most other Southeast and South Asian sending countries. So, I mean, just in terms of taking the Philippines example, then in host countries, so the UK would be one example where our health service relies on migrant workers. Post-Brexit, it's going to be very interesting to know how any of us will, manage to get a doctor's appointment, frankly. But at the Philippines embassy in many countries, receiving countries where there are Filipino workers, there's a labour attaché specifically in the embassy with responsibility in part for welfare of migrant workers in that country. Not many of the other sending countries have labour attachés, to my knowledge, in key receiving countries that have got that remit. The domestic workers is not an area that we have engaged with, simply because in terms of leverage with the private sector, it extends as far as domestic workers within their own sort of expatriate workforce, which certainly is part of the remit, but it's very small. The ILO are doing some interesting work in that area around domestic work, but in terms of the vulnerability, that is probably where the greatest vulnerability is, because exactly as you say, it's hidden, and it is incredibly difficult to regulate. So I think that's that one is a huge challenge.
Jenny, if I could ask you a question before I throw out to the floor again. I mean, with ACT, you're really looking at trying to develop what you call that sort of system-wide or approach, an institutional response. Could you say a little bit about how that differs from, for example, global framework agreements, and maybe some of the lessons or comparisons between the two?
Well, they're really different.
Could you just explain?
Wouldn't really. Okay, so a global framework agreement. They've been around for some 20 years now, and they're basically agreements between global companies and global unions on an individual company basis, and they have various provisions, but normally they commit the company to observing the ILO core labour standards in their own operations and in those of their suppliers. So it's freedom of association, collective bargaining, forced labour, child labour, and what am I missing?
Sounds about right.
That sounds about right. Mine's gone blank. So they vary in their effectiveness. Some of them are really just on paper, but they were an attempt to go further than unilateral company codes of conduct by actually putting the unions into the picture and working with the company to ensure that those provisions are met. Some of them really only focus on the direct employees. For example, I was interested, we have a fairly new one with Total, but in the garment industry, it's all about the supply chain. That's very different from what we're doing with ACT, even though it's also a global level agreement, but the function of that agreement is very different. Hope that explains.
Please.
Thank you. Robin Waller, Chairman, Diversity in the Workplace. A very broad question. In general, is the employer side, independently of type of business, more active or more aware of and more committed to use time and energy to increase from their side the trust level versus the labor side?
Anyone?
I can do Nigeria. No? No, from the trade unions in Nigeria, they could say that there is an increased trust level and a good level of negotiations and dialogue in the core of those with permanent jobs, senior jobs, organized, etc., within the multinational companies. But they would also complain that the same company also deliberately outsource and use contract works exactly to avoid unions. So they would describe it, and Nigerian workers are angry, especially the junior workers who are the ones who lose their jobs, who go into contract situations, and say that they pull the rug out of their base and they lose job security, get lower salaries. And I have to say there are also senior workers who are contracted out. But generally it's so they describe this almost in colonial terms of indirect rule, and so that's the no answer.
Francis, did you come?
I'd say, trust is probably not a word that's cropping up all that often internally within companies looking at these issues. It's driven, it's driven consumer pressure, media scrutiny for sure, and what we found has been one of the biggest drivers recently for progress in this area is the UK Modern Slavery Act, where companies with a global turnover of over £36 million per annum who have operations in the UK are required to make an annual statement as to what they're doing to tackle forced labour and modern slavery in their supply chains, what steps they're taking. So it's not just British companies. And I mean, I think that, trust will inevitably lead to some areas where there is an increase in trust, but I don't think trust is the initial driver.
This goes back to what Jenny said at the beginning. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just to say, well, I think there's two problems. I mean, trust, it's not really a driver, as has been said, but also the problem now is who's the employer? And this is, I mean, we treat the brands as if they're the employer because we think they're responsible, and the UN guiding principles say that they're responsible, but they say, well, we're not the employer, and then you see all of this myriad outsourcing arrangements to avoid employer responsibility. And in the context of the ILO, it's very difficult because what are called the employers in the ILO are not the multinational companies that we're dealing with. They're the members of the local chambers of commerce in the production country. So it's very complicated. Everyone's trying to avoid being the employer, because if you're the employer, then it's the buck stops with you, and nobody wants to be that person. So it's, complicated.
It's a moving target.
Yes.
It's a moving target. We need to wrap up. I'm sorry, but we're now eating into people's lunch. So please join me in thanking the presenters and enjoy your lunch afterwards.